Coming up on this week's RegCast.
We haven't seen any big fines since Citi was fined £44 million a couple of years ago, but I don't think that really matters because the regulatory messaging is fix this, and they want firms to be doing that, and that's going to cost you money regardless. And if you ignore them, they're going to be really annoyed, and they might see that as a aggravating factor. When you do come around to a fine, they'll say, like, listen, we told you this 18 times and you didn't listen, so now you have to pay.
That everybody could agree that we'd like to have the horizon scanning happen, that we'd like someone to be able to work together as banks, because that's not our primary business. But then the connection from that into our policies and procedures and any given bank into our taxonomy of controls, because we are each unique in the way that we've built our product sets and our footprint in different countries and in different geographies, different states, means that the value of that input really requires more than just the data. We need a system.
You need to have a tool that doesn't define your governance, but provides a work methodology that allows for flexibility to address the different governance that applies within an organization. Whether it is governance in the sense of which department needs to adhere or needs to comply with which regulation, or up to the level of who needs to be involved in the creation of an internal document like a policy, or who needs to approve. I mean, governance at all those levels.
You can't just throw thousands of people at managing these problems. Technology exists to help it. You would rather have your thousands of people, because those are the numbers that we're talking about, do more value add activities, to do that, get to the 80-20 rule, right? Where you have tools doing 80% of the work and folks people doing the 20% of that work.
The starting point of the whole process is having all the applicable regulations in scope, and then determining how the different responsible departments can work together to actually address those and translate those into internal documents.
Yeah, it always bewilders me that we're all concerned about control, and trust, and safety, and truth, and then we just hand it over to an AI to make some decisions for us.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Welcome to RegCast.
RegCast, where we shine a light on banking digitization.
Hi, welcome. This is PJ Marino, CEO of JWG, and I'm pleased to be hosting another round of RegCast, looking at how we manage regulatory risks and controls. Really, for the past 18 months since the COVID crisis, we've had an awful lot of new controls layered on the industry. I'm sure we'll get a perspective from our esteemed panelist on that. But this has been a problem for an awful long time. How do we map all the things that we do to check that we're doing everything right? And obviously, since 2009, we've been asked to do an awful lot of things in financial services, and we have a constant horizon of data that we have to keep on top of that's north of 30,000 documents a year to scan. So one of the things that we're highlighting for our conference coming up is the need to really look at all these non-financial risk controls and tie them back to source, tie them back to policy, tie them back to business, tie them back to controls, raise all the activities that we have within a bank. And that has to happen globally. So it's no small ask for a really big bank to take this all on, and it can be a really expensive journey. But fortunately, RegTech gives us some tools to help digitalize all this. And I think that's the whole digital integrity brand or hashtag that we're trying to promote at the conference. So I would like to start just with a quick round of introductions. I'm going to go to each of the panelists in turn, ask them to introduce themselves, and then we'll go ahead and ask them the first question. So in order, David, can you please just give us a quick introduction, please?
Sure, I'm David Silverman. I work at Wells Fargo currently in the compliance department, working on regulatory control build-out projects. And in the past, since about 2004, I've been at Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, and JP Morgan, at all places right before or right after one of the many crisis events our industry has had, where we've had to increase compliance dramatically.
Thank you. Peter, can you please introduce your role?
Yeah, my name is Peter Vissers, and I'm part of the Spark team that is part of ING. before joining the Spark team, I've been working in ING in the international network. Last position was country manager in Brazil, where I was actually a regulatory change management problem owner. And by moving to Spark, I actually became a regulatory change management solution provider, because that's what Spark does, a integrated end-to-end regulatory change management solution.
Thank you. Poacher become gamekeeper, or maybe vice versa. Monica, what's your current role in your history in this space?
Hi, PJ. I'm Red Hat's EMEA Financial Services Chief Technologist, and I'm based in London. And prior to joining Red Hat, I spent most of my career at big banks here in the UK, mainly names like Barclays, RBS, and Deutsche Bank. For my sins, I delivered MiFID II for Deutsche Wealth Management, as well as GDPR and PSD2. Hence my interest in this topic, and I work quite a lot with all of the banks across EMEA now that are our customers on solving some of these challenges with technology.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Rachel, you're no stranger to RegCast listeners, but why don't you give a quick introduction?
Hi, I'm Rachel Wolcott. I'm a senior editor at Thomson Reuters Regulatory Intelligence. I've been here for about 10 years, covering all kinds of regulatory and compliance matters, from MiFID II to EMIR, op resilience, financial crime, diversity and inclusion. All the topics come across my desk.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I'd like to kick this off with a relatively straightforward question, but it's certainly not an easy one. David, I'd like to go to you. What is it that after a decade in this space of looking at the problem end to end, how far have we come towards digitization, or digitalizing the horizon scanning and understanding whether that maps our controls?
So I think there has been progress. The progress has mostly been in good systems for housing all the data, so that we can at least at one level of the company have our regulations and our controls and our policies and procedures. But at the same time, I've seen very little progress on stitching that together. The groups operate distinctly in the company. We have our own problems to solve. We talk in different data languages, different taxonomies, and we have not been able to crack the problem as an industry of how do you do this end to end without armies of people to interpret every step along the way? How do you get from legal to compliance to a control team to a front line, between procedures and tests and risk assessments, without people doing the interpretation? And that, I think, is the challenge and the opportunity. How do we get out of being a waves of people business and compliance?
That's a great way to put it. I think you hit the nail on the head in that point about we're just too many languages, and it's hard, and it fundamentally becomes a language problem for the various tribes involved in implementing or interpreting or deciding business policy. And I think that fundamentally that's a standards issue, and it's some way to think about then how you're picking up what's coming off of a regulator's website. Tell us a little bit more. I know we've had a number of consortia type conversations around how you might think about standardizing that space. Why hasn't it happened?
Yeah, we've tried, and everyone has called the idea of a regulatory utility that I've talked to for the financial industry a sort of the best idea that nobody seems to know how to get done. And I think part of the challenge is, let's be honest, if you want to talk innovation, regulatory compliance and legal isn't the place that you'd first turn, especially in a bank. We're worried about risk management. You know, you can innovate fast and furious on a consumer internet product. You don't want to innovate fast and furious and risk anybody's bank account. That's just not reasonable. So we rely on the rest of the world getting there ahead of us. And this would be breaking new ground. And I think that was the challenge, that everybody could agree that we'd like to have the horizon scanning happen, that we'd like someone to be able to work together as banks because that's not our primary business. But then the connection from that into our policies and procedures and any given bank into our taxonomy of controls, because we are each unique in the way that we've built our product sets and our footprint in different countries and in different geographies, different states, means that the value of that input really requires more than just the data. We need a system, and we need ways of talking about the data that lets us interpret, as you said, all the different regulators. They have their own language of the way they talk about transactions with affiliate. In the US, it's Reg W, it's something else in the UK, and they're slightly the same and slightly different. How do we turn that into what is our procedures? And that joining up turns out to be extremely difficult for financial institutions, not like a payments process like a Visa or a know your customer, which has been hard on its own, but there's been more progress on people joining up together. There's definitely something to be done there, but I think the industry needs to mature a bit more, and we have to have more digital and more standards in what we get from the regulators to be able to take that next step.
Yeah. And therein lies the challenge, because the regulators don't really want to wade into that space. You know, they might be happy to offer a framework, but giving actual prescriptive guidance on how, that is a bridge too far.
That's right. And, you know, in some ways, everybody's ability to comply shapes how our products are built. I know that there are products at the firm I work at that we don't offer because of the regulatory requirements, and there are other products we do offer, where some other bank might have the opposite. So there's an advantage to be able to understand the regulations in a way to tune your product set to say, we'll offer something based on what is allowed, and to be able to manage the cost of the compliance. And every bank takes that on differently and takes it differently on over time. So that knowledge is buried deep in the front line. And that's not often the groups that get involved in these kind of discussions.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Peter, let's go to you. I guess you had a number of roles where you've been on the other side of this. Now you're taking a look at how to help organizations adopt new RegTech tooling. What's your perspective?
Well, I definitely have some thoughts on that, PJ, and I think actually David already kind of created or defined the context a bit and how challenging it is within the different departments in the organizations. Like, who owns the problem, who needs to find the solution. If I would look at, okay, what do FIs, banks need to do in terms of selecting the right regulatory change to address that challenge, I think firms need to look at an end-to-end solution for managing the regulatory change. And I think that solution needs to cover, and David mentioned it already, horizon scanning. I mean, they need to be aware of what regulations are applicable to them. It needs to cover risk identification, ownership, control expectations, policy creation or any document creation to evidence your compliance, control and procedure design, implementation, oversight, and ultimately compliance reporting and assurance, because ultimately the whole tool needs to enable and allow the organization to evidence its compliance with the various regulations to an auditor or a regulator as well. And I think that's a challenge. But that solution also needs to address, PJ, the biggest pain points that we analyze or observe with organizations in terms of their regulatory change management, and for which they need to find this solution, this RegTech solution. And some of those pain points are that they need to have, or the solution needs to provide a single source of truth, so that everybody throughout the organization can work with that same interpretation, analysis of the regulations and how an organization needs to comply. I think, and this is something David was alluding to as well, that a solution needs to basically provide a standardized way of working throughout the organization that allows for collaboration across all lines of defense, across departments, across geographies, so that everybody talks the same language in terms of how they how they process regulations into internal policies, etc. Because otherwise, it's basically becoming very difficult to address the apparent challenge or status quo, I would almost say, that exists within a lot of organizations of working in silos when it comes to regulatory compliance. And one of the pain points that needs to be addressed in that through that tool, that RegTech tool, is also having to have the visibility. And now I'm really talking about the horizon scanning of knowing at all points, like which regulators are in scope for you, which regulations, what obligations and policies. And very importantly, you need to be able to, the tool needs to be able to address the pain point of having, being able to actually evidence your compliance to a regulator. So
that's the difficult bit, right? So everyone has a different set of regulations across the bank, and they have to tie back to a single set of truth, which means you have to trust that the sources are all represented in some sort of common way, and
yes.
They don't start off common. So there's a lot of work to do just to get that, as you say, single source. Tell us about what it takes for people to adopt that as part of their working process.
Well, if let's say you can build up with horizon scanning a universal library that's applicable or accessible to the whole organization. And every area will need to address different points, but it may also be that certain regulations apply to different parts of the organization. So if you have a tool that can facilitate that, you need to have a tool that doesn't define your governance, but provides a work methodology that allows for flexibility to address the different governance that applies within an organization. Yeah. Whether it is governance in the sense of which department needs to adhere or needs to comply with which regulation, or up to the level of who needs to be involved in the creation of an internal document like a policy, or who needs to approve. I mean, governance at all those levels. And it's across departments, but it's also across geographies. Because if you have a bank that has a global presence or a presence in Europe, you will need to comply with regulations at different levels. So I think the point that you're raising, PJ, is crucial when it comes to RegTech tool selection. An important element, and actually the starting point of the whole process, is having all the applicable regulations in scope, and then determining how the different responsible departments can work together to actually address those and translate those into internal documents.
I think you just hit on something very near and dear to Monica's heart. She loves control libraries and had lots of experience mapping to them. Well, to tell us your perspective on with all these new detailed controls. I mean, they ask amazing things that we wouldn't have thought of when we first started putting control libraries together. How hard is all this mapping, and what does it take for people to get that right when they're doing these projects?
I think it's incredibly difficult, and I don't even think we've gotten it right. I think that's the problem, PJ, and I think that's sort of what Peter was, not to put words in your mouth, Peter, but possibly alluding to. It is a minefield, and it's nearly impossible for firms to keep up with. And one of the things that I always think about is this adapting versus responding. And in the past, we've always had to adapt to to respond to, I said that completely wrong, respond to all of these rules. And firms have just said, okay, we're just going to, everywhere has to comply to whatever rule that we think is the highest standard. And in doing so, they've prevented themselves from being able to adapt, to be able to be flexible. And I think that's where I think there's going to have to be a shift if we want to keep up with the speed that customers are asking for, that regulators are now asking for, also to be able to innovate. We have to be able to create space so that we can continue to innovate, so that we can continue to offer the best products and services for us, right? For the next generation of consumers, for all consumers. And when I've spoken with some of our customers recently, it's been about how can we help them automate compliance? How can we have a standard platform to automate risk and controls to increase the transparency of these risks? It's been a lot of trust going on between the control functions and the business and IT. And I think that circle has to be, that triangle has to become a circle so that people start to trust each other more, because if not, we're going to continue having so many different controls, and it's going to continue to be such a nightmare. And it's only going to get worse as technology proliferates.
Yeah, and I think that I see why you talk about that circle, because they're very different actors, right? Your CIO or your first line of defense, CISO, when it gets to an IT control, they'll take accountability.
Yep.
But it's very different when you start talking about the rest of the non-financial risk controls and the op risk. And so there's a whole series of people that need to play in. And I get that they need to have a flexible system, but are the organizations themselves starting to converge? Are they starting to understand the need to be on the same source, same system?
I mean, in conversations I've had, and they have been fairly disparate, I think they're thinking about it, but to David's point, we're at this point in the world where we're having a turning point, right? You can't just throw thousands of people at managing these problems. Technology exists to help it. You would rather have your thousands of people, because those are the numbers that we're talking about, do more value add activities, to do that, get to the 80-20 rule, right? Where you have tools doing 80% of the work and folks doing, people doing the 20% of that work. So I think they're talking about it, but we're talking about changing the direction of an oil tanker on a dime. That's not going to happen. And equally, the tolerance in the system for the bigger firms to take risks is fairly low. Whether anybody likes to admit it or not, there's a certain amount of safety that the big companies, the big banks offer us. And I always talk to my colleagues about this, and I say, can you tell me the last time you went to an ATM machine and couldn't take out cash? Nobody. I get blank looks back, because the answer is they can't think of a time. I said, tell me the last time, and this is an opportune time. Tell me the last time one of the tech companies went down. Last night we had this massive Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram outage. Now, I mean, I'm not really a user of Facebook or Instagram, but I do use WhatsApp. But how many millions of businesses run on those platforms now? Nothing's going to happen because they went down. But I guarantee you, if Wells Fargo or Barclays or RBS had a half an hour outage or an hour outage where people couldn't get their cash out, it'd be a whole different ball game. And I think we tend to forget that.
Yeah, to some extent, we here in the UK, we were lucky enough to have some big outages about 3-4 years ago. And Rachel, you've been digging into then what's happened since. Tell us about what you think is on the regulators' control agenda, and how's it been driven by some of this the technology infrastructure issues, to put it that way.
Well, I think what's driving the regulatory agenda in terms of controls right now really dovetails nicely with what everybody's been saying on the panel. They're concerned about this lack of joining up across the piece in terms of regulatory reporting, for example. That's something that came up in the PRA's Dear CEO letter outlining its displeasure with firms' regulatory reporting. They talked about lack of automation. They talked about too much manual intervention, basically non-compliance with BCBS 239, which is the risk data aggregation and reporting principles. I think that was basically what they were getting at. But they were also talking about interpretation of rules and inconsistency in that. And they've really done a lot to try to drive home this message. They've commissioned a lot of Section 166 reviews, which are skilled person reviews, which are pretty costly to firms. So it's not a fine, but it's going to cost you money to get somebody in to go through all your reporting systems and tell you what's wrong with them. And they've been really beating the drum on this. We haven't seen any big fines since Citi was fined 44 million pounds a couple of years ago. But I don't think that really matters, because the regulatory messaging is fix this, and they want firms to be doing that, and that's going to cost you money regardless. And if you ignore them, they're going to be really annoyed, and they might see that as a aggravating factor when you do come around to a fine. They'll say, like, listen, we told you this 18 times and you didn't listen, so now you have to pay. So it's not just the PRA, and it's not just reg reporting, although I did take a look, and the CFTC has put out 5 swap reporting fines in September alone, and then there was another big one in June. And another thing that's coming along in the reg reporting space is the EMIR refit, where the only standards kind of conversation that's happening there is outside of the regulator. I think that's being led by PJ and his merry band of digital regulatory reporting people. But the ESMA really wants firms to be improving their data quality. They want firms to report when there are significant data quality problems, and they've decided what significant means even. And they're trying to make trade repositories more accountable for data quality, which is also sort of interesting. I mean, just
So
to kind of,
I guess what I'm picking up is that it's they want them to fix this, and vis-a-vis priorities, it's the stuff that matters to the regulator.
yeah. Well, I mean, they can't figure out what you're doing unless you tell them in a way they can understand. I just wanted to touch on a couple of other things that went across some of the themes that the other panelists has brought up. Financial crime is another one where we've seen a lot of bodies thrown at the problem and a lot of money. And this actually goes to Facebook as well. Facebook's line is, well, we've got 40,000 people and we've spent $16 billion trying to fix our fake news and problem. You know, why isn't it working? It's like, that's the same thing that banks say about financial crime. We've got 4,000 people on the job and we've spent $1 billion or whatever, yet, you know, financial crime is all over the place. I mean, it's not totally banks' fault. I mean, governments aren't particularly supportive. You know, the UK has been dragging its feet on its economic crime plan, for example. But, you know, I'd also say the automation that we've seen today so far, I'm not really clear how useful that is because, again, we still have lots of economic crime, partly because criminals are really good at using tech too, apparently. So I think the jury is still out in that regard. And then just to go back to what Monica was saying about operational resilience and outages and whatnot. This is something that this is going to be a heavy lift for firms. I mean, I remember I was talking to Monica last week. She was talking about all the different operational risk points that were identified at one of the banks she worked with, and that seemed like a pretty big task to catalog that and map everything, which is what the regulators want you to do. And they're really concerned about what they call the financial services supply chain, you know, whether that's operational or cloud computing or people working offshore. They're worried about all of this. You know, they see some of the issues in a very similar way that they see the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal being blocked by that giant container ship. You know, something that gets lodged in the system, it's going to, you know, take a week to figure out how to get it out. Meanwhile, like all the plastic doodads from China aren't getting to Europe and the UK and the US, and that's causing all sorts of problems. So I think that, you know, that's a big mix of issues, but I mean, I don't think any of them are particularly new.
No, but I guess that what's new is that there is this much more detailed focus and much more systemic view. And if you go back to where Peter was in terms of scanning the horizon, looking at identifying the risk, coming up with the controls, and then doing your reporting and assessment, that's an awful lot to be doing across a very broad pitch. You know, the regulatory perimeter is so wide and so vast that you really need to have this sorted out. So this has been a great set of perspectives. I want to flip on to the closing question for everybody, give you some proper time to answer a two-part question. So David, swinging to you again. What are the areas which you'll be focusing on most at the conference, and what are you also looking forward to hearing from the regulators and the other panelists?
So the thing I find that truly is challenging here, and that I'm interested in hearing how other people are going after, is granularity. And by granularity, I mean the many layers we have to comply at. We have to do stuff from the top of the house view of how am I doing globally on money laundering, down to there's a requirement that on all of our mortgage applications, the font size can't be less than 14 point. And if we screw any of them up, we can be in trouble. And we've got 100,000 requirements out here. We got 100,000 controls over here. And to the person who's doing the form for the loan, that font size matters. The person at the top of the company, that doesn't matter. I care about this giant thing. How do we collect data, and how do we align people to get all of that working? Because exactly as Monica said, it's the ATM goes down is a very different thing, and even more critical. When it comes back up, is the amount in there the same as when it went down? If my bank account changes by a penny, that's a radically different thing than I lost a Google search or all my photos fell off of Facebook. It is systemic to the functioning of the economy of the world. So how do we get this right, and how do we solve for granularity? That's why I'd like to hear what other people's ways of working here, because all I've ever seen is, yeah, we got one system maybe for this level, but then everything here and everything here, that's PowerPoint up here, and down here is my spreadsheet.
So it is the connecting the many various tribes, as we talked about earlier, and those different perspectives, and how do you get back to single source?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Peter. What is on your agenda for the conference?
Well, PJ, I think a lot I will focus on is really how organizations need to organize themselves to really address this regulatory challenge, this regulatory change challenge, in an efficient and effective way, and what tool selection they have there, and how they need to integrate that, and how they need to collaborate. Kind of some of the points that I addressed in the question you asked earlier, to really create that audit trail, and how to collaborate, and how to make that an efficient process, and actually the importance of that. And because, you know, ultimately it's not just about having a process in place of translating regulation into policy. It's so dynamic because, as you mentioned, the regulatory context changes constantly, gets updated. So you also want to know that if you've put something in place internally, a policy or something on the basis of a regulation, and the regulation changes, well, where did you apply it in your organization? Just global level, at different locations? What documents were created on the basis of that policy? So how can you monitor all that? How you keep track of that? So that type of assessment and analysis of the impact of regulatory changes in the regulatory environment, I will be touching upon that as well, and how the right tool can actually assist you in that.
And if not just regulation changes, but if the interpretation of it changes, if somebody else gets in trouble because of the way they did it, you find out you're doing it the same way, right? How do we know what's gone on in the industry?
Yeah,
exactly.
I like how you talked about that earlier as a system, David, because it's not an input. It's a very dynamic system. It's not just one input gets some output. There are many factors that need to get taken into account. Yeah.
And that brings actually, PJ, to another point, which I could talk about, or we'll talk about as well, is the importance of you can rely a lot on artificial intelligence or all these new innovations, but in the end, It's also about expertise that needs to be applied, knowledge, experience in the process. So you cannot fully rely on all these innovative tools that are available to you. You still need to assure that you have room in your process for that expert knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, it always bewilders me that we're all concerned about control and trust and safety and truth. And then we just hand it over to an AI to make some decisions for us.
Yeah, I fully agree.
A black box, you mean?
Oh,
Yeah.
maybe. Monica, you've had a bit of experience in that space. What are you
Yeah.
looking for at the conference?
I mean, I'm going to come from a completely different angle, which is either going to be loved or hated, who knows. But for me, the three things I'd like to take away are actually more looking towards the regulator rather than, how we as firms or I guess tech companies can interpret the rules and implement them. I think the first thing, with my consumer lens on is around education. I really would like to understand, what the regulators and even our governments alike are thinking about from an education point of view. And the example that I'll give here is PSD2 or open banking. That entered into force the 25th of January, 2018. So nigh on, my goodness, what year is it now? Almost 4 years ago. Sorry, I've been stuck in my spare bedroom for a year and a half. Time is kind of doesn't matter anymore. Nearly 4 years ago, right? And according to a poll that Finexa reported on mid-September, 14% of the UK population completely understand what open banking was all about. Right? 14, that's less than a fifth of the population understand it. Probably that fifth actually works in the banks. So for me, that means that there needs to be some sort of dialogue between the regulators and the people that they work for, which is ultimately us as consumers. And for me, that just feels like a gap. And the more complicated things get, the more complicated technology is brought in, like AI, for example, almost feels like a time that we should be being educated more and having more of a dialogue. The second area where I'm really keen, and I think, both David and Peter talked on it before, and I know this is one of your bugbears, is on harmony. It just feels like the world is completely interconnected, but our laws are not necessarily, there's a bit of a Tower of Babel, and we talked about that on the call previously, the meeting we had previously, PJ, but that Tower of Babel is only getting more complicated, and it feels like we're almost kind of at this crunching point where something has to give. So I do think that's something that, is something I would look to hear some information on that. And then the last thing is, again, this could be contentious, is, the banks, and we've all talked about it, and all of the firms and insurance companies are modernizing. They have different ways of working, and we are using more technology. What are the regulators doing? Are they changing as well? Are they also thinking about different, more agile ways of governing? And for me, I think that that's an important conversation to have. And it's not poacher turned gamekeeper, or is it gamekeeper turned poacher? I think it was gamekeeper turned poacher. It's just about, if we're trying to run a modern bank, what does that mean from how that modern bank is going to be regulated? And how does it fit into the overall system, which it is a global system now? And how can the bank also try to protect some of its, national or fiscal sovereignty? So for me, those are really where my focus would be.
Excellent points, and they will stretch us, but we will get there. Rachel, come off of mute and tell us what you're looking forward to.
Well, one of the things that I think that I'd like to see are some real life examples about what people are actually doing with RegTech in-house, and have them talk about how some of the solutions that we've come up with so far are solving problems and making a difference. Because I think people need to have, like David said, a more kind of granular conversation about it. Like, I need some deets, essentially. And then I want to pick up on what Monica was saying about the regulators, and this goes to what Peter was saying about horizon scanning, because I think horizon scanning has become a big issue for regulators too. And this is why they can't figure out what to do with Binance and Coinbase and all these guys. They're like, oh my gosh, they're everywhere, but they're nowhere. Are you in charge of them, or am I? Like, are they in the regulatory perimeter or not? We can't decide. Like, I find that to be interesting. And a less exciting example than crypto and the regulatory perimeter are some of these technology firms that now regulators are deciding actually are financial infrastructure, like swap execution facilities. And I think this is something that's another big CFTC theme. Like, dear tech company, we actually think that you're operating a regulated market. We suggest that you become registered and do some stuff about it. And that's something that's coming up with the Dutch regulator as well. I know the AFM is looking at this issue, and I think the FCA said they were too. I can't remember, but technology is changing the perimeter, and you can't put the onus on these new companies to say, hey, don't you realize you're supposed to be regulated? I think the regulators need to do some stuff in that regard as well. So maybe they need some of Peter's horizon scanning.
I think that's
looking at the other way.
Just to wrap it up, because we are short on time. I think, Rachel, you bring up an excellent point, which is, this RegTech conversation, which has been going on for over a decade, it has gotten a bit insular, and it's there if you pay attention to it. But there's so many reasons not to pay attention to it, and it really could be more relevant from a business perspective, from a controls perspective, just from a making things simpler for people perspective.
Yeah.
And then what I'm looking forward to the conference is really how do we pull that message together for everyone, because everyone hates doing it the way they're doing it. I mean, they're comfortable with it, but they know it could be so much better.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to get all the deets at the conference, but certainly we're going to have 6 months of replays and booths and demos and all kinds of stuff. There's people who kind of get involved and hopefully open this conversation up a bit. So I want to thank you all for giving us your time. Very, very fantastic overview. This is going to be a very wide-ranging discussion, but we want to narrow it down and get to some real practical insights. And I look forward to talking to you soon.
You can go to our conference website, which is regtechconference.co.uk, or go to the JWG website, which is jwg-it.eu. This is RegCast,
where we shine a light on banking digitization.